ask to record it for some colleagues, and then we will edit it. So that's why we are asking you to sign the authorization for recording, which I guess is not a problem, but if it is, just let us know. We are also going to organize everything as to have the chance to leave, to catch trains and planes and so on, as whenever you need to. Jonathan is our assistant here, and he will walk you to the taxi station just in case. So we will do it step by step. So feel free to ask him to take you there when it is needed. Also, we are inviting you to, after the session, once back home, if you want to send us a post for our blog in the Public Law Institute Observatory, we'll be very thankful for that. A blog, it's only 1.5 pages, so we will be sending you maybe a request to contribute with a summary of your lecture, which would be really nice to have. So thank you in advance. Also, I would like to thank you all for being here. I will be very short. Only one instruction: in order to correctly record our session, we will need to ask you to press the red button here, and when the light comes, it means it's recording. Otherwise, we will miss your interventions. The session has been organized by the Giménez Foundation, the Forum of Federations, and here in the Institute for Comparative Federalism, and here. And the observatory is also benefiting from this gathering. So I'm very thankful to Mario and the rest for being nice and sharing this opportunity to have a discussion on language, which is a topic which here in Catalonia is quite a hot topic, in the sense that it's top on the agenda, I would say, not only hot in the sense of the topic, which is also right now, as Eva will very kindly summarize and present the question. So only a few words to welcome you here. Thank you for the effort. I know that you have been traveling several days and there's still some travel ahead. So good luck with boiling and so on, and the companies. And thank you very much for being here. I hope it will be a very fruitful discussion. And you have the floor to organize the lectures. I don't know if you want to say something. No, sure, or anybody wants to make some comments in advance. No, thank you.
Thanks for the organizers for offering me the possibility to participate in this workshop. Many thanks also to the speakers for sharing with us at the Facultat de Dret, School of Law, their experience around the topic that brings us together. The question of languages, the management of linguistic diversity, and the legal shaping of models of plurilingualism is present in most countries of the world. According to a comparative study I published in 2016, not counting reference to language directly linked to fundamental rights or human rights, such the right to an interpret before the court or the prohibition of discrimination on linguistic grounds, in 154 of the 193 state constitutions, there are linguistic laws that articulate the coexistence between different languages present in a state territory, either through the notion of official language or other related expressions such as language of the Republic, national language, etc. Also, there are other types of clauses related to the territorial distribution of power, the regulation of a state institution, or other sectorial reference. These data are not too different from those obtained in a more recent study elaborated within the framework of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, called Official Language Designation, in which the language question is highlighted constitutionally in 156 states in the world, while in others there is subconstitutional legislation with prescriptions linguistics. The interest that this question arouses is due to the intersection between the linguistic conflict and other constitutional issues, such as the territorial distribution of political power, local autonomy, the rights of original peoples, or even freedom of expression of the right of education. This interest is particularly focused in the legal linguistic systems of a multi-level governance. However, the comparison between the different state language models is really complex, especially because the basic notions of language law, such as the aforementioned official language, national language, or in Catalonia, own language, must be interpreted in the entirely of the legal system, a non-legal system. If, in addition, if the concept is not only descriptive, but attends to the implementation and effectiveness of the linguistic clauses, the assessment implies the intersection with consideration of socio-political, socio-linguistic, or demolinguistics. It should be borne in mind, based on the example of the Spanish state, that constitutional provisions, in our case, basically Article 3 of the Spanish Constitutions, which established the basis of a system of double officiality that must be regulated by the corresponding statutes of autonomy with regard to the Spanish language and other, Castilian, excuse me, and other Spanish language, tend to be, this constitutional framework tend to be very scientific, which is the subsequent intervention of legislator and interpretation of course that contributes to shape the model. In a comparative context, Catalonia has one of the most developed language legislations, with the start from the Statute of Autonomy of 1979 and developed by the Law of Linguistic Normalization in 1983, and after the Language Policy Act in 1998, and that sought to consolidate the 2006 Statute of Autonomy. This legislation expressed the protective will of a regional or minority language in the context of the European Union in order to spread its knowledge between the whole population and to achieve its functional fullness and normal use in the different areas of reality. As shown by the work currently carried in Catalonia within the framework of the National Pact for the Language, Pacte Nacional per la Llengua, National Pact for the Language, this objective of knowledge and functional fullness of the language and normal use have not yet been achieved. From a legal perspective, the reinterpretation of the concept of own language, lengua propia, as an essential descriptive concept in the Statute of Autonomy of 2006, and the reformulation of the new limits in the Judgment 31/2010 of the Constitutional Court, pose important challenge when defining language policy relating to the Catalan language. Well, in order to talk about this question in a comparative perspective and to organize the debate, to cover the main aspects of areas where language regulation is protected, we will ask the speaker for a general description of the linguistic model, and then we will analyze linguistic legislation and current challenges that arise in some of the main areas as institutions, education, and media and other sectors. And we will start with Elisabeth Albert from Italy, and we will continue with Patricia Popelier from Belgium. After we will talk about the Spanish case. And finally, Leslie Seidel, we will do an overall perspective about this question. Thanks, and we will start with this first overview about the linguistic model of every speaker. Thank you very much. 5 minutes, yes, every round 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me here in this workshop. I'll try to give you an overview on linguistic rights and linguistic policy making in Italy. Basically, Italy is a regional state organized in an asymmetric way. This means that it is that there are 20 regions, and out of the 20 regions, 5 regions have a special basic law, a special statute. And we do find different interesting also linguistic models in some of these special regions in Italy. But first, altogether, in relation to the 3 sectors we are looking into, in relation to public administration, in relation to media and to education, I would like to say that in Italy, we do have a career-based model of monolingual civil service that is valid nationwide, that the Italian constitution from 1948 does not explicitly refer to Italian as the official language of the Italian Republic. It does, however, refer to the protection of linguistic minorities. This is a principle that is enshrined in the Italian constitution. Nevertheless, Italian is the uncontested official language of the Republic of Italy, and this is codified in several ordinary laws or codes, or also, for example, in some of the statutes of the regions, so in some of the basic laws of the regions. The regions in Italy do have, and this refers also a bit to the point of education and also languages at regional level. The regions do have a wide set of competences. Special regions have more competences, more explicit competences than ordinary ones, but it's a principle is that it is actually up also to the regions to deal with their cultural linguistic diversity in the respective region. So in the field of culture, laws can be that can touch upon actually considering variants of the many Italo-Romance dialects that are in place. Then I would like to now, this being said, basically that Italian is the official language of Italy, and that we do have altogether a monolingual civil service across all the peninsula of Italy. This being said, there are especially two interesting territories within Italy that have a multilingual reality, and where also more than just Italian is institutionalized as an official language. These 2 territories are 2 special territories. So it's at the one hand the Aosta Valley, where you have bilingualism, French and Italian in the public sphere. And the other territory is the autonomous province of South Tyrol, that together with the autonomous province of Trento forms one special region in the regional system of Italy. And in South Tyrol, you have at the subnational level a political system that corresponds to a power sharing system, to typical consociational democracy principles, and that is based on the institutionalization of 3 languages because of historical reasons. In South Tyrol, there are 70% German speakers. It is a territory that historically has been part of the Habsburg Empire. Then out of geopolitical reasons, it was annexed to the back then yet Kingdom of Italy, and it remained with the Italian state also after the Second World War. And then the question came up how to actually make sure that the German speakers of South Tyrol can exercise their internationally guaranteed right, because there is an international agreement between that is annexed actually to the peace treaties after the Second World War, that basically says South Tyrol should be multilingual, and the German speakers shall have the right to speak German in the whole public sphere, including also in the judiciary. So that they have the right also in the judiciary to actually go on with proceedings in German language. This one. And the second is that German speakers should have the right to have and set up their own school models that correspond to the right to mother tongue. So this is basically the overview. To sum up, basically, these are two territories which are small within Italy, but have many detailed regulations when it comes to multilingual civil service, more types of education models, and more and plurality of media as well.
Thanks very much. We will talk about the experience of Belgium.
Thank you. I'll be brief, so I will not go into the details of a very complex system. But in Belgium, we have 3 official languages, which is Dutch, French, and German. And German is spoken by a very small community, about 70,000 people. That's less than 1% of the Belgians. And then we have the 2 major groups, and that's where all the tension goes. The French-speaking and the Dutch-speaking. And the Dutch-speaking are the majority, about 60%. But they have the minority language in a way, because French was always a dominant language. For a long time, it was also the access to key positions in society. So the Flemish movement was much about also not just language and culture, but also about social position. This tension is then solved institutionally in a system that became decentralized more and more. We call ourselves a federal system now, and it is based on power sharing at the central level. German-speaking community has nothing to do with that. It's about the French and the Dutch-speaking groups. In a sort of confederal model of decision-making. And secondly, a dual form of federalism with exclusive competences, so as to not interfere with each other. And language is also a competence that is on an exclusive competence of these subnational entities, which means that, for example, education and media are exclusive competences in uni-linguistic communities. And this also means that if media, for example, you have the Dutch-speaking media, you have the Walloon media, and they don't even talk about each other very much. So this means that it creates a sort of social divide in the Belgian population. For the public administration, we also have the territoriality principle, which means that the language that is spoken by the administration is the language of the territory. So either Dutch or French. We have some exceptions in municipalities with facilities, and in some cases this as well creates quite some tension, especially where social reality does not is not in conformity anymore with the legal language of the region. I think that is in brief the initial setup.
the Spanish case.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. In short, I will explain the situation of languages in Spain. The Constitution in the Article 3 says that the Spanish Castilian is the official language of the state, then in the whole territory of Spain. Second, that the regional languages are official in each territory according to what the statutes of autonomy will say. And third, that the other linguistic varieties are protected or will be protected. According to this constitutional regulation, we have then Castilian, that is a language spoken in the whole territory in reality. Here we don't have this territoriality as in some multilingual federations, that in some territories people don't speak the language of the other territory. I show, and in the report there are the figures about the use and the knowledge of the different languages in Spain, and we can say that in all the autonomous communities there are, even in which there are other official languages, an important amount of people speak Spanish and have Spanish as their language of identity. After the Spanish like language generally spoken in Spain and generally known by all Spanish citizens, we have the first situation to underline. In my opinion, there are three, we could say the strong languages, at least politically strong, because they are supported politically very, very strongly, and because they are linked to the identity of each community. Is the case of Catalan, called Valencia in the autonomous community of Valencia, in the three autonomous communities of Catalonia, Balearic Island, and Valencian community. In second, we have the Basque language, official in the autonomous community of the Basque country, in the whole territory of this autonomous community, and in the northern part of Navarra, in the so-called Basque-speaking zone in Navarra, with a special status in the mixed zone around the capital city of Pamplona. In third, we have the Galician language, official in the autonomous community of Galicia, and in fourth, the Aranese, a variety of Occitan language, official since 2006 in the Val d'Aran in Catalonia. But we have other language situations in Spain. We have had a kind of development on the knowledge about what was the reality of languages in Spain. Traditionally, there are two enclaves, language enclaves, especially in two autonomous communities. The enclaves or Galician language in El Bierzo and Sanabria in the autonomous community of Castilla and Leon, where Galician is traditionally spoken and so it is recognized, and the enclave of Catalan language in the east part of the autonomous community of Aragon, in which is also traditionally spoken by most of citizens. And other than that, the reports of the Committee of Experts of the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages have shown that there are other situations. The most important for the amount of people speaking this language is the case of the language of Asturias, Asturian language or Leonese, especially in the autonomous community of Asturias, in which the Statute of Autonomy doesn't declare it as an official language, but declared that this language called Bable or Asturian would be protected. And there is in this autonomous community, there is a special act for the protection of the Asturian language. Another situation similar to that is the case of Aragonese, but in Aragon, it has been a very complicated process regarding the protection of these languages of the community, even regarding how to call each language with different acts in different times with different political majorities. And finally, the Committee of Experts of the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages have shown also the case of Amazic in the city in the north of Africa, the city of Melilla. And other, this is a clear case in which the majority of the city speaks Amazic, but there are other situations in which I think there are very, very strong doubts about the existence, the reality of these languages, like Extremeño in Extremadura, or like the traditional Portuguese language as traditional language, not as a foreign language, in the city of Olivença in the province of Badajoz. And I have forgotten also a very small enclave in the province of Cáceres of Galician language in 3 small villages in the north of the province. I think this is the framework of the situation of languages, of official languages in Spain. Then, according to the statutes of autonomy, most of these languages are official, beside with Castilian language in these territories. The only thing that could be discussed comparing with other multilingual federations is that in Spain the concept of territoriality linked to the declaration as an official language is limited to the territory of each autonomous community. And these languages don't have any kind of what we could call a federal status in front of the authorities and public authorities of the state.
Thank you very much. And now if Lucy said I want to make a contribution. No, after. No, sí. Sí. Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't aware that I was to provide an overview, so I prepared some notes on the question of instruction in minority languages. This is nevertheless relevant to your request, because in the papers that have been published as part of this project, and we're hoping that by the end we will have 13 papers, most of them have been published already. One of the issues that figures in many of the papers is the question of instruction in minority languages, mother tongue languages, and so on. And another issue that has come up in a number of the papers is the power of English. And this relates to minority language education because in some countries, particularly in private schools, there are efforts on the part of certain authorities to provide much greater room for the instruction of English, which in certain cases means that minority mother tongue education gets less space or even gets pushed out entirely. But on the minority language question, I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview of Canada. And the first point to make is that whether a language is a minority language actually depends on where you live. And I'll illustrate this in just a moment. And another important point is that the federal structure and constitutional provisions of a given country, and it's particularly the case in Canada, have a major impact on how effectively the right to mother tongue education is implemented. And I use the word right because I think it's correct. Of course, like all rights, it's not absolute. But in the overview paper that I'm writing for the project, I trace how in international instruments, among other places, linguistic rights have increasingly become interpreted as human rights. So in Canada, just a quick word about demography. Looking at the country as a whole, French is the first language spoken by nearly 22% of Canadians, and that's down about half a percentage point since 2016. This is in the 2021 census. Now in Quebec, and this lies at the heart of the Canadian story, 82% of the population reports French as the first language spoken. So in many ways, Quebec is the opposite portrait of Canada as a whole. About 80% French as first language spoken, whereas in Canada as a whole, about 80% report English as the first language spoken. Now, over time, there has been a series of efforts to protect French. A major platform of Francophone Canadians, whether they were at the federal level or whether within Quebec province, has been that the French language is threatened, fragile, deserves protection. The language varies depending upon where you sit and whether you're political and so on. But this precariousness is nevertheless a key driver of language regulation, both in Quebec and in Canada as a whole. The legislation started in the 1960s at the federal level with the passage of an Official Languages Act. And that had to do largely with federal services, but it didn't cover the field of education, which is a provincial domain under the Canadian Constitution. I'll come back to that in just a moment. In the 1970s, the independence movement in Quebec gained considerable support, and the Parti Québécois was elected to lead the provincial government in 1976. And a core measure of that government was passed the following year. It's called Law 101. And part of it, I won't go into the details because it affected various areas where French is used or where it was not used enough. But an important area was in the field of education. And in Quebec, the present situation is that only the children with at least one Canadian parent who received their primary education in Canada may go to primary or secondary school in English in Quebec. So the children of immigrants have no choice. They must go to school in French. And it's a relatively small number of people who have this right to go to school in English. In the rest of Canada, in 1982, as part of an important constitutional reform, the last time the British Parliament passed a constitutional law for Canada, and Canada became the master of its constitution completely in 1982, That reform included a provision for minority language education across the country, so that if you're Francophone living outside of Quebec, you have a right to education in your language, but this is tied to the number of children residing in a given area. And the same thing applies in Quebec for the children of English-speaking parents. Now, this law, this part of the constitutional reform, lies in a way like an umbrella over the provincial jurisdiction over education. And because it was passed by the British Parliament, it had that level of constitutional authority. Now, some of the provinces were not very enthusiastic, and it took a number of court cases over into the 1990s for the practical terms of this constitutional provision to be determined. And the courts have also decided that over time that the Francophone right to education includes also a right to school governance. Basically, that the Francophone parents should be able to elect a school board, and that school board runs the Francophone schools in a given part of the country. Now, in Quebec, as in the rest of Canada, the proportion of the population who speak French and who can access these rights has been declining, and this continues to be a major part of political debate. The federal government has a bill that's almost through Parliament that they're hoping will strengthen the position of the Francophone minorities across the country. However, the degree to which the federal government has effective tools to do that is quite limited, and one of the reasons is because Canada is a very high immigration country. We now have set a goal for 2025 to accept 500,000 immigrants every year. And yes, some of them do come to Canada speaking French, but they're a very, very small minority. So I'm going to finish up quite quickly just with a couple of very general points about the papers from this project as they relate to, particularly to minority language education. The protection and the support for minority languages in education and elsewhere is often one of the impulses that led to the creation of a federal state, or to the evolution of a unitary state towards a federal structure or towards a devolved structure. Belgium is a very good example of that, but there are other ones, of course, as well. Spain, in some ways, because even though the 1978 Constitution has not been amended in very significant ways, there have been very important changes through the organic laws, which are quasi-constitutional. I think that's correct to say. So the Spain of 1978, not only on language, but in other areas, is not the Spain of 2022. There's been evolution towards a more decentralized or devolved state. The protection of minority languages also, this is a simple point, but it is sometimes, I think, overlooked in the rhetoric. It's not a problem. It's not a problem that can be overcome or responded to by a single solution. When I worked in government, the staff who worked for me were basically instructed not to use this language, particularly not to use the language of solution when you're talking about language rights, federalism, Quebec, Canada, independence, etc. These are part of they lie at the core of highly diverse societies, and they are a dynamic that is going to continue. And so countries may have moments that are more tense, and they may have more moments that are calmer, but they are nevertheless going to live with this reality. It's analogous in a way to the position of migrants within many of our societies. We are not going to find one answer that will give perfect integration to migrants, because the society changes, the composition of immigrants change, the economy changes, etc., etc. And just a final point, linguistic guarantees can in some ways be seen as an index of the generosity of a given country. our Spanish colleagues have given examples of very small communities who nevertheless have been given recognition. I'm not clear, maybe we can hear more in the discussion period, what this means in practical terms, for example, in the provision of services and so on. But if a country is willing to give official language status, we're talking about this in Canada with Indigenous languages, particularly in the northern part of the country, if a country is willing to give that kind of recognition to languages that are spoken by very small minorities, it says something about that country. Now, you don't want to be hypocritical and recognize something and not do anything about it. That isn't the right approach. But it does say something if you take that very first step, and particularly if you put it into the Constitution. And so when we think about this area, it isn't just legal, it isn't just service provision and so on. It's also a question of the tissue of the society and the social cohesion, to use a term from other disciplines that these kinds of measures can encourage. They're only one among many, because we shouldn't ever exaggerate. Just because we're working on a given question, we shouldn't exaggerate its importance. But nevertheless, it has these policies have a potentially helpful and significant role to play.
Thanks very much. The last intervention has introduced the question of education. If you agree, we can talk about education. And in that case, no, I think that we start with Elizabeth Albert, Antonio Lopez, and Elizabeth Albert, Patricia, and Antonio. Thank you.
Yes. In the Italian case, education nationwide is obviously given in Italian language, but I will now zoom into the case of South Tyrol. So this is the very, very north part of Italy. It's a territory that borders Austria and a territory that borders also Switzerland, and it's basically in a triangle in the very north part of Italy. So when it comes to education, as I have introduced beforehand, this territory has a difficult history because it belonged originally to the Habsburg Empire. It was always populated by German speakers and also Latin speakers, so speakers of a Rheto-Romanic language. And then it was basically after the First World War annexed, forcibly annexed. And it underwent a difficult period of Italianization policy, with repressive measures under the Mussolini regime. And to cut a long story short, after the Second World War, it was decided because of geopolitical reasons that the territory of South Tyrol would remain an Italian territory, but that this territory, South Tyrol, would be granted a education system that respects the group rights. What do I mean by that? The South Tyrolean autonomy is based on group rights for Italian speakers, group rights for German speakers, and group rights for Latin speakers. So Latin, German, and Italian are the three languages the whole system, the whole political system is based on. In education, this means that the statute, the basic law of South Tyrol, contains an article number 19, that actually foresees the right to mother tongue. This means that German speakers have the right to be taught by teachers that are of the same mother tongue, so by teachers of German mother tongue. Nevertheless, in German, in schools using German as a main teaching language, you do have obviously also the duty to study Italian as the second language of the territory, because Italian and German are co-official in the whole public sphere in South Tyrol, and also vice versa in Italian and German are co-official in, yes. So in South Tyrol, you have co-officiality of German and Italian language in the whole public sphere. This is linked with the bilingualism exam that you have to sit. And this is obviously linked also with a quota system that establishes how the whole public sphere and the finances and so on are distributed in relation to the percentage of the different language groups that live in South Tyrol. It's an institutional mechanism. It's per se, technically speaking, not a mechanism that forces you to choose which identity you want to have. It's a mechanism for institutional purposes to make the power sharing system work, okay? And within this system, you have three different education models. You have schools that run primarily with teaching language German, where you have the obligation to study Italian, but you also have English. So it's basically more languages. Then you have schools that run with the teaching language of Italian. And then you have the school model of the Latin language group. And this is a so-called teaching parity school model, meaning that in the two valleys where the Latin speakers live, there is the school model that follows the rules that Italian and German language are both used as languages of instruction. More or less 50-50, then it depends on the school type, on the class, and so on and so forth. And also the Latin language is used as a facilitation, as a vehicular language. When it comes to the administration of the different school models, education system, German speakers do administer their schools, their education system. Italian speakers administers their own, and there's also a department for the schools and cultural affairs for the Latin speakers. This being said, it is not as separate as it seems, because according to power sharing systems, still basically the directors of the different administration offices cooperate continuously. And you also have at the political level the inbuilt obligation into the Statute of South Tyrol that nevertheless who wins the election in South Tyrol, you always are obliged to form a coalition with the respective other language party of the language group. So in South Tyrol, since the late 40s, basically there has been one governing party, the South Tyrolean People's Party, that represents the German and the Latin speakers, the interests of the German and the Latin speakers. But even though they have always won the elections, and they always won the elections with actually quite a large majority, they are forced to enter a coalition with an Italian-speaking party too. I leave it here now.
Much for your summary. It's really complex, and we will talk about Belgium. That I think it's a different system in that case. Yes.
Well, indeed, education, as I said, is an exclusive competence of the communities. And so they decide how education is organized, and they decide which language is used. But they have to take care that the language of the region is the dominant language. And this means that in the German community, with schools where education is in German, in the Flemish community, it's in Dutch, and in the French-speaking community, it is in French. Brussels is bilingual, but it's not a community. So that means that we have no bilingual schools. It's the French and the Flemish communities that are both competent in Brussels, but for the unilingual institutions only, which means that we have either French-speaking or Flemish, so Dutch-speaking schools in Brussels. What they decide as to which language that is used and whether it is compulsory to speak the, so to also learn the other language, well, depends on their own policy. And what we see is that in the German-speaking community and the Flemish community, it is compulsory to also study the other language. In the French, in most of the times in the Brussels schools as well. There's even some experiments of immersion where they really teach some classes in French, some classes in Dutch, but in the balloon part, it's not compulsory to choose the other or another national language, and English is most popular there. Of course, you can choose where to send your children. And what we see, for example, in Brussels, where only we don't have official countings, but more or less 10% of the people living in Brussels are Dutch speaking. But we see that a lot of French-speaking families send their children to Flemish schools where they have education in Dutch. And this becomes a bit of a problem. One of the reasons why they do it, one of the reasons can be that they want the children to learn both languages, but another reason is also a difference in quality. So according to rankings, the Flemish education system always had much better scores, although lately we are not as good anymore, apparently, but in any case, better than the French-speaking system. And so French-speaking children go to these Flemish schools in Brussels, which means that there is no place anymore for the Flemish families, and up there again you have some tension in our already divided country. I think a solution could be just to have these bilingual schools in Brussels, which is now a federal competence, but the federal government is not taking this up, so we should give it very explicitly to one of the other institutions that we have in Brussels to do that.
Much, yes, Antonio Lopez, this is your turn.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'll try to summarize a little our report. In Spain, in our constitutional perspective, is two competence of the autonomous communities. This topic we have, but in this field of education, two main issues, and both are troublesome. The first is in Catalonia concerns the use of Catalan as the only language of instruction, except for the subjects Castilian language and literature. And the second issue in some other autonomous communities as Galicia, Balearic Island, and Valencia. This point is to say that the Balearic Island evolved a little from this new education law 1/2022, that's evolved a little in the sense of evolution system like Catalan, maybe. Okay, then in relation with the first system in Catalonia, and relating to this first one, in general terms, it is important to note that in 1994, the Constitutional Court endorsed the legitimacy of a system of education in which Catalan was the center of gravity, as a compulsory language of instruction without preventing the use of Castilian as language of instruction for those who choose. During the first decade of the 2000s, there was a little disagreement over the refusal by the Catalan authorities to incorporate a third weekly hour of Castilian language, thus failing to comply with a basic national regulation on the school curriculum. Since 2010, the conflict has focused on the request by some families that Castilian should also be used as a language of instruction in certain subjects, apart from Castilian language and literature. The government of the autonomous community of Catalonia refused to accept this request, and the dispute reached the court. The High Court of Justice of Catalonia took numerous decisions, some of which were ratified by the Supreme Court. And in 2020, the High Court Justice of Catalonia, in response to the Catalan authorities' refusal to comply with the Supreme Court's decisions, ruled that the authorities were obliged to use Castilian as a language of education in 25% of the teaching in the class when requested by a pupil's family, and imposed a deadline for this to be implemented. In November 2021, this decision was ratified exclusively on procedural grounds by the Supreme Court. And the judicial decisions are highly problematic. These decisions are highly problematic, as is the Catalan authorities' refusal to allow Castilian as a language of instruction for the pupil whose family so request. The Supreme Court's decision violates the right to choose who choose to receive an education entirely in Catalan. This is as noun obligation, a conventional obligation, and so far it is problematic. But it is also it's also to recall that the Charter for Regional and Minority Language does not demand compulsory education in Catalan for all pupils. It should be made available so that all pupils will receive education in Catalan if parents so wish. Co-decision on the requirement not to use Castilian as the language of instruction in 25% of the subjects in a given classroom when a parent so demands have significantly altered this political debate. This context, the reaction of the Catalan parliamentary majority is significant. And in 2022, when the deadline to implement the Supreme Court decision on the 25% rule was approaching, the Catalan government passed Decree Law 6/2022 on language plan in schools, and Parliament passed Law 8/2022 on the use and learning of official language in non-university education. The aim of this Catalan legislation was to prevent the ordinary courts from continuing to apply the 25% rule. In the light of the new legal situation, the High Court of Justice of Catalonia has stopped the application of the legislation and has submitted the question of its constitutionality to the Constitutional Court. In spite of this, in September 2022, the High Court of Justice of Catalonia issues several enforcement rulings requiring the application of the decision on the 25% use of Castilian as a language of instruction in 5 Catalan schools. The law on improvement on educational quality is to say, introduced the obligation in 2013, an obligation to guarantee the right to receive education in Castilian, but that law was reformed in 2020, and in which section on language of instruction reads as follows: educational authorities shall guarantee the rights of pupils to receive instruction in Castilian and in other co-official language in their respective territories pursuant to the Spanish Constitution, the Status of Autonomy, and applicable legislation. A balanced approach so far to this issue would to be guaranteed the use of Castilian as the language of instruction in some subjects apart from Castilian language and literature for families who so choose, while preserving Catalan as the majority language of instruction. at the same time, families should be able to choose to have education entirely in Catalan. And this is the only option that could resolve the issue and respect Spain's obligation under the European Convention, the regional or minority language. Well, as pointed out in our report, we want to find a compromise. If we want to find a compromise, a balanced approach in order to reconcile the situation that really exists in the education system as a whole in Catalonia and the requirements derived from the constitutional framework, which exclude monolingual regimes, as was already clear along the constituent debates, and in this trajectory revealed to the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court, is then to try to guarantee both. On the one hand, in order to observe the Constitution, that families who so wish could have bilingual education for their children in Catalan as the center of gravity, if so deemed, and as long as so deemed by the legislator, and in Spanish to a different extent according to the legislator criteria, but in any case as a vehicular language beyond is learning as a curricular subject of Spanish language and literature, similar to other subjects as English language, for example. And on the other hand, in order to fully satisfy the commitment assumed by the Kingdom of Spain in this European agreement, and a school with Catalan as the exclusive teaching language, in despite of a subject of Spanish language and literature for those families who so wish it. I can less here on the debate. Thank you.
Yes, only to complete, they have talked about the Catalan model, but there are different models of language education, language use of language of instruction, separation models like South Tyrol, and conjunction models like the model of Catalonia. There is no separation on languages between the pupils, between the students. And also in the Catalan model is not an uniform model. There's a strong diversity between, for example, primary school, secondary school, universities. And really the use of Castilian is in the secondary school is really important, I think more than 25. In other place that the conflictual situation, I think it's as a judiciary conflict, but there is not a social conflict with you in Catalonia about this question, because there is a strong social support to the school that guarantee the knowledge of both official languages. The question is, some models of Spain doesn't guarantee the effective knowledge of both languages. That's for us the objective. No, there is the final objective is the knowledge of two official languages, and in Catalonia all students have the knowledge of two official. It's true that there isn't put the accent in the use of Catalan language of instruction. It's really true, and it's in that sense it's a model that's not equivalent to another models in other regions, no, but I think that present that a really conflict. I think the reality that we live here, it's not so conflictual, because no, it's not conflictual. There is a judiciary conflict, very, very strong, but no a social conflict in Catalonia. I think it's that the question. No, it's a legal conflict, really a legal conflict, but not presenting as a social conflict, because it's not the reality of our society. A legal, yes, judiciary conflict. Yes. No, thank you. So it's only to and we continue after. There is only to see that there is not only one model. It's a wide diversity of education models in Spain. Catalonia is one model, and there are other models of separation and other models of conjunction with percentage of languages. We don't have percentage. That's a question. Yeah. But I think but the situation, the whole situation, it's not only one question. And about institutions, I think that before one say that in one might distinguish federal institution or central institution and regional institutions, and how the use of languages in central or in regional level. About education,
I just. Well, there we go. Okay, it was just to pick up on a point you made, which I think is an important one, about. I believe you said that there's a legal conflict about the Catalan system, but not a social conflict, and I think sometimes in this very broad area, because it's often highly politicized, the tension and the conflict within the political class is sometimes greater. It's not as though they are creating something. It's not theater. They are, in their own minds, reflecting society, but they may be out of touch. They may not recognize that, particularly politicians of an older generation, they may not recognize that society has been changing. Whether it's, for example, in Quebec, the intermarriage between French-speaking and English-speaking families, and also people from other backgrounds and so on. And sometimes they, of course, are leading organizations, and they believe they're responding to their membership, but they may not have a very good reading. The paper that we published on Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I've forgotten now, I'm sorry, the 3 official languages of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But one of the points that the authors make is that the 3 languages are really not so terribly different. And for most people, they're mutually comprehensible. Yet there are very major tensions within the country and in the units, the constituent units within the country. And the authors argue that this is because it's the business of the leaders of these organizations and also politicians to exaggerate rather than diminish the differences between the different linguistic communities in the country. So I think that's something to think about when one looks at this as an instrument of social cohesion, a way to diminish some of the cleavages that have existed historically in different countries.
See, the point is, what you say, not that for us it's not only a problem, it's a richness, no? The use of different language and this objective, no? And the plurilingualism of people and the knowledge of different languages. Okay, and about institutions. Elizabeth, if you want.
Yeah, again, I now zoom into the 2 realities, to the 2 territories I have been mentioning. So one being South Tyrol and the other one being Aosta Valley. So in South Tyrol, basically all public offices, so all the sector of public administration runs in 2 languages. Obviously, it's based on the principle of territoriality. Basically, you can all over South Tyrol approach, to make a practical example, a police officer either in German or in Italian language, and the police officer has to reply to you in the language you approach him or her. And when you get communication from an officer, then again, to make an example, the police officer might approach you orally in German language. And if you favor speaking Italian, then you can reply in Italian, and the police officer has basically to switch the language. So this is called also in technical jargon, the public administration, public offices basically run according to the principle of presumed mother tongue when it's oral interactions. So they presume your mother tongue is either German or Italian, and they use it, but you have the right to switch the language, and the officers have the obligation to then follow the language you actually chose. And in one part of South Tyrol, there is trilingualism. So meaning that the Latin speakers have the right to receive communication in Latin language. Very practically speaking, all this means obviously that the papers come already in bilingual form or in trilingual form. This is obviously related very much then to the system of employment. To be employed in public administration in South Tyrol, you have basically to prove your language knowledge. And not only, there is a quota system in place, which is considering the percentage of each language group. So basically, again, practical example, if you have 10 open posts, 7 might belong or be reserved to the German speakers because they make up 70% of the whole South Tyrolean population, and 2 or 3 might belong to the Italian speakers because they make up 26% of the whole population in South Tyrol, and 1, or depending how the percentages are, for the Latin speakers. All these principles are being used in recent years also in a flexible manner, because it's difficult to find also qualified personnel. So for example, in the medical sector, there's a lot of derogation when it comes to the quota system and to the obligation of knowing the languages, in this case, German and Italian. And in Aosta Valley, it would be French and Italian, but Aosta Valley has a more flexibilized system. It is a bit less regulated, if I may, so it's simplified than the South Tyrolean one. That means that there is derogation based on continuous bilateral talks and many acts and so on and so forth between Rome and South Tyrol. This derogation says that, okay, you can disregard the quota system and you can disregard the fact that the doctor does not speak German or Italian, but there's the obligation of the doctor to learn the respective other language within first it was 3 years, now it's 5 years. If he or she does not do so, he or she will not be employed permanently. I think I can leave it with this. Yeah, you will not. This is very. Yeah, of course there are. This is.
Happens because there is a social need.
But this derogation with regards up to 5 years has been very recently introduced, actually. But this to say that the quota system was very fundamental in the past to basically repair, if one may say so, the disequalities that have been created by the Italianization policy. But now, if you look into the different categories of public administration or into the different sectors like hospitals and so on and so forth, more or less the percentages are equalized. So it's 70% German speakers actually have also more or less 70% of the jobs in the public administration, just to say so. And the problem now is obviously you have to balance the merit principle against the principle of the need principle, the merit principle, and also the fact that you would like to have persons that speak the languages of the place. So these 3 principles that have to be balanced, and very often obviously the need principle prevails. And it's not only a dynamic in South Tyrol, it's a dynamic of many territories from what I know from my comparative studies. And so we speak of a flexibilized quota system and a flexibilized obligation to know the institutionalized languages from the very beginning.
Very interesting. And Earth is very, very interesting. Yes, Patricia.
So in Belgium, we have the principle of territoriality, which means that for the federal institutions, they are bilingual. They send out all communication in French and in Dutch. Doesn't mean that all civil servants speak both languages. We have groups of both. In the regions itself, the language of the region is spoken, or communication with the citizen has to be in that language, which means French in the French-speaking linguistic region, German in the German-speaking one, Dutch in the Dutch-speaking one, and then Dutch and French in the bilingual linguistic region of Brussels. And apart from that, we also have some municipalities with facilities. These are around the border, so the whole German-speaking community has facilities for the French-speaking persons. And around the linguistic border between the French and the Dutch-speaking side, there are also several of these municipalities on both sides of the border. But where the most problems arise are the municipalities around Brussels, which is in the Dutch-speaking region, but a majority of the residents in those municipalities is French-speaking. So the idea is communication is in Dutch unless the residents want to be spoken to or to be addressed in French. Now there are two interpretations of these facilities. So for the Dutch-speaking, the facilities were something that was given as a transitory measure. More and more French-speaking persons, especially from Brussels, but also from Wallonia, came to live there. And so the originally Dutch-speaking municipalities became more and more Frenchified. The idea was that they would accommodate to the language of the region, Dutch, but were given some time. The interpretation of the French-speaking parts, however, was this is a facility that is given to us. It's permanent and we can always use it. So the interpretation on the Dutch-speaking side was you have to, again and again, ask, for example, to have your tax form sent in French, because otherwise it will be in Dutch. Interpretation on the French-speaking side was, well, you only have to say it once that you want to have it in French, and we will always send it in French to you. And this became a major issue, especially because the mayors, French-speaking, have that interpretation, but the Minister of Internal Affairs was Dutch-speaking and would not appoint these mayors because she said they are not in conformity with the language regulations. So we had first decisions by the Council of State on that, and agreeing with the Dutch-speaking side, but the French-speaking part would not feel that this was legitimate because this was a Dutch-speaking chamber. With the sixth stage reform in Belgium, we tried to find a solution, and now for this kind of conflicts, the Council of State is the competent court, but in the Grand Chamber, which is a bilingual chamber. So both French-speaking and Dutch-speaking jurists are looking into it, and they came up with a more balanced interpretation. So it's neither the French-speaking, neither the Dutch-speaking interpretation. It's something in between, a balanced solution, which means, okay, predominant is the language of the region, which is Dutch, but you cannot put that to the extreme. And they allow registration of the language of the residents and for French-speaking people to be registered for 4 years. And after 4 years, they have to again explicitly say whether they still want to have the communication in French. And so we hope that that war now is solved for the moment.
If you don't like me to speak about this subject, I don't have any problem. Your commands are my willings. Regarding the use of official languages in administration of before the public authorities, I think we have to divide in two fields. Directly regarding the administration of autonomous communities, I think in general, indirect relationship with administration, there are no problems. We have to take into account that in 1991, the Constitutional Court declares, according to the Constitution, the possibility to ask the knowledge, oral and writing, writing of regional official languages. And then since that all the autonomous communities in which a second language is also official with Castilian, the ask for this knowledge has been general. We have some problems, Elizabeth has related to that, especially in some autonomous communities. We have to take into account that the reality is very different in communities like in Catalonia, where the knowledge of Catalan is quite general, and other communities in which the regional language is a minority language, like in the case of the Basque Country. Because of that, in some autonomous communities, we have problems in the health system and in the regional police also, but not in direct administration. The problems had arisen in two fields of very different importance, in my opinion. The first is the peripheral or the direct administration of the state in the territories of the autonomous communities in which a second language is also an official one. As has reported several times the Committee of Experts of the European Charter, there is here a very important problem. But in my opinion, it's especially a qualitative issue, because it shows that for state administration, the knowledge of the acceptance that in these autonomous communities with two official languages, they have to ensure that the possibility to use also the regional official language. The forms are bilingual. The problem is especially in oral relationship. It's not, in my opinion, a very important quantitative problem, except for treasury administration and in some autonomous communities for police forces. Because if ours is not exactly a federalism of execution, but mostly the direct relationship with citizens is in the hands of the autonomous communities, and because of that, it's more important to ensure the possibility to use the official languages in direct relation with regional administration than with this state administration, even if I said, in my opinion, is a qualitative issue. The most important problem, in my opinion, and according to these reports of the Committee of Experts of the European Charter, is in judiciary. in before courts. There is a problem, an important problem, and there are, the reality indeed is that the use of regional official languages before courts is very limited. It's very limited in practice. And in my opinion, that shows a real problem regarding the possibility, the real possibility to use these languages in courts. Here, the Committee of Experts of the European Charter showed that here there are two kinds of problems. The main problems are, on the one hand, the problem of the system of recruitment of judges and personnel and staff of courts, in which state doesn't take into account the necessity to ensure the possibility of using the language, the official languages in autonomous communities. And there is also a legal issue regarding the regulation in the organic law of judiciary in the Article 231, in which the law imposes that judges, the law accepts that judges can use regional official languages, but they are obliged to use Spanish if one of the parts asks for so. And this is completely the opposite, the contrary, that Spain has take as obligation when ratifying the European Charter, in which Spain, in my opinion, without realizing what undertaking they are taking, Spain accept the obligation to develop, to make the process in the regional official language if one of the parts asks for so. Then, in my opinion, here is the main problem regarding the use before public authorities in Spain.
Thanks for this summary. It was very difficult to do it. Thanks very much. Yes. No. Thanks for the concision and exactly photograph of the situation. And now we can talk about.
I may suggest that we wrap up.
Yes,
and
yes.
We can talk also about media in our interventions, but not having a new round about media and so on, because otherwise we will finish without debate at 5:30. So to speed up, we want us to open the floor for comments and discussion. Myself, which is always what happens. So we open up around the debate and the floor for discussion. But we would invite you, if you have something that is interesting about media, to highlight it.
Yes. Well, I only have that. I don't know if Canada, it's not, but the question of the reform of the federal law of language and the question of Aboriginal peoples also, no? There is a great debate, I think, no, in Canada at this moment about autochthonous people and Aboriginal. The agenda, no, at this moment about languages, this question has appeared, no, the agenda, this question, I think.
Well, yes, there's a bill to reform the Official Languages Act that's before Parliament. And there isn't anything that is qualitatively new in it, but because it's quite a large area of federal law and public administration, it touches on quite a few different topics. On the indigenous languages, there was a law passed in 2019, and it relates to, I mean, its practical impact over time remains to be seen, but it fits in with the theme that I mentioned earlier about helping to bridge divides within society, because one of the main purposes of the Indigenous Languages Act is to help achieve, along with many other measures, reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples who have been not only in their language, but also in education and in many other spheres have been marginalized and the subject of systemic discrimination in Canada. Indigenous peoples account for about 5% of the Canadian population. So they're not numerous, but as with language policy for other communities, number is not the sole criterion. It's one criterion, and in the Northern Territories, there are a number of languages that are recognized. The most significant one is not in numbers, but nevertheless in the scope of what has been done is in the Nunavut territory, where the Inuit people are a majority, a fairly large majority, even though they only number about 35,000 altogether. And they are making efforts, it's quite difficult, quite challenging, to make Inuit the main language of public administration, to have service to the public, to have documents. But as with some other Indigenous languages, there isn't a standardized form of Inuit, and so there's work in progress, and this of course applies with some minority languages in Europe, to create a kind of a standard basis, a dictionary, a lexicon, and so on of the language. So with Indigenous languages, we are in some ways quite far back, but in other ways we've moved forward in some significant ways. If somebody had been discussing this, let's say 30 or 40 years ago around this table, I don't think they would have predicted that there would be a federal Indigenous Languages Act passed in the first 2 decades of this century. So there's, as I sometimes say, there are some spots of light. It's in this area, as in many other areas, it's easy to be critical and say, well, you're not doing enough, but doing something, getting started is itself worthy of being noticed.
To raise the question, because regarding the administration, especially the federal state administration on the territory, providing services which belong to the state, but offering them in Spanish and sometimes in Catalan raises some questions, because we don't have any piece of legislation in Spain that regulates the obligations of. Then I wanted to raise the question that sometimes this is left, the absence of a general legislation in those cases opens up the question for each department or administration ministry to choose. For instance, here in Catalonia, it's not the same. The same rules applied for the fiscal administration. I would make a joke about, getting money at any price with any language, and then they are very flexible. But it's different when you address, for instance, the social security, where you can find much more difference. The question for me is tricky, because I think the judiciary really has particularities, especially when we are going to appeal, etc., and the language of the procedure. But there, it's more a practical question of recruitment of civil servants and how do we recruit them, because they're officials, I wouldn't say highly qualified, but they maybe recruited by the state, but there are people who are working here. You can find people speaking Catalan, even though that might not be absolutely compulsory or a requirement. So you can manage that. But there are other networks of more qualified professionals, let's say fiscal inspection or inspectors or top officials of the administration, where there is more movement among them. And this is more difficult to impose any language requirements to so highly qualified professionals. And that creates, I wouldn't say a problem, but a kind of a friction on the system because it's not properly adapted. That's one question. The other one is the typical discussion about if language can be a condition or, you know, points to be recruited. I would, as a second question, so I'm abusing the micro here, but the second question is that regarding education, we have a very highly political debate here, which is contaminated by politics. That's absolutely true. And I fully agree with Eva that sometimes that amplifies the kind of problem. I don't think we have a structural social problem with the Spanish language in Catalan education or in primary and secondary. Nevertheless, I think that the legal problems posed or brought by certain families that don't come neither out of the blue or are purely artificial. They reflect a sense of minority use of the Spanish language that reacts to the fact that, and it's a feeling, maybe it's not the reality, it's not the reality everywhere, which is not at all, but in certain cases that might reflect the feeling of becoming a minority, a Spanish minority, Spanish-speaking minority in Catalonia, with very minimum amount of education for your children in Spanish. And then the judiciary came up with a solution which is 25%. Where from? But the technique to solve the question is a technique which probably is very improper or very useless. But the problem, I think it's not a generalized problem. It's not a social structural problem at all, but it's a question of a minority. Now, the other way around is the Spaniards, Spanish speaking, that feel like a minority, to frame it. Mm-hmm. Please, this is the March Reach.
No, I can just follow up, and that obviously that this perception, maybe we can call it also perception, because it's a very individual approach, obviously is also true in the territory of South Tyrol, that actually then Italian speakers are numerically speaking a minority within the system, and the perception has for many years also been that they suffered, I oversimplify now, they suffered of so-called disagio dell'essere italiano. So disagio, that was the term actually. So discomfort of being an Italian speaker in South Tyrol, where you are a minority within the political system of South Tyrol, even though you are an Italian passport holder, and Italy is actually all over, let's say, rather monolingual when it comes to public administration and so on and so forth. So this perception problem and this reversed majority-minority issue has been and is also still very much discussed also in South Tyrol, and this also somehow gets obviously politicized, as you were saying, very often, and augments also the fear or inhibits a more relaxed approach towards language learning and language use. in a more practical and in a more pragmatic manner. And what is also maybe worth a mention is the fact that even though there is derogation with regard to certain professional profiles when it comes to the obligation to know the languages, there is also on the other side an incentive for everybody who comes and works in South Tyrol in the public sphere to learn both languages, because first of all, it's very often a requirement. But if it, for XY reasons, is not required, or if you have a derogation and you can study it alongside with some years, then there's incentives also in semi-privatized companies that you actually get an allowance, you get a bit paid more, and so on and so forth. There's many different techniques actually to actually to raise the interest in learning the languages of all the institutionalized language groups. It happens also in the Aosta Valley. The Aosta Valley also has this so-called bilingualism allowance, which is an extra coin, an extra pay in your, an extra money in your salary, in your payslip. Yes, but interestingly, if you compare empirically Aosta Valley and South Tyrol, in Aosta Valley it didn't work out that much actually. In South Tyrol, I mean, depending which professional profile you are and which category, which proficiency of the language you are, it gives you 100 to almost 300 euros more in the payslip. So it makes a difference.
In Belgium, what's happening is that the demand, I mean, the public offer for civil service requires in the Flemish community speaking and the course which are Flemish and so on, there is few people who have command of both languages, so that many people is having to make an effort to study Flemish in order to compete to get those public service placements, which is an interesting way of making it attractive.
Yes, I would like to discuss a bit, not very long, but the matter of education. In my opinion, there is a first question that, especially from a comparative point of view, is really striking for me, and is the question we have to ask is it possible to deny the possibility of studying even a limited part of the education in a language that is official in the territory? I think this question is the first question we have to ask and to answer. There is no multilingual federation in which this is possible. The broad understanding on what does mean a language to be an official one is that citizens have the right to use it even in education. We showed yesterday that there are different models, and we have seen today also that in Spain there are different models. In my opinion, the Spanish legal system has been very flexible because has accepted two things that in a comparative point of view, some of them in the last years have been opening the way in this direction as Patricia explained regarding the Flemish education system. But the first thing that shows the Spanish flexible attitude from the legal system is that it's common that our system is not a separatist system in education according to languages, but an integration system. Then it's obligatory it's compulsory for all, because when they finish the compulsory education, they have to show that they manage both languages quite well. And then the legal system has accepted that it's compulsory to learn also the other language, the other official language. And there is a second point in which Spanish legal system has shown their flexibility. Is broadly accepted in our system, and the case of Catalonia is very clear when the Constitutional Court accepted, as Antonio said, that Catalan, without any problem, can be the center of gravity of the education system in Catalonia. That most of the matters of the subjects of teaching can be imposed in one of the two official languages. And then, if we consider this situation, my feeling is a bit strange, because especially if we have into account two realities, two facts. The first is, I showed yesterday, and there is in the report, what is the real feeling regarding the languages in different communities, in different autonomous communities. I not only see the official documents regarding what declares people, what is their language, but I always see in the surveys of the Centre de Studies d'Opinió two kind of questions that I showed yesterday. The first is, in which language do you like to be asked? The half, with small differences from one year to another, the half say, I want to be asked in Castilian, and the other half, I want to be asked in Catalan. And the other fact is that in Catalonia, it has not been a conflict regarding that. It's true that it has been a broad consensus about the use of Catalan as the language more important in instruction. And in Catalonia, as far as I know, nobody asked until now, but I wouldn't say that in the future would be the same, nobody asked for having the whole education in Castilian. Only few subjects. And my question is, especially taking into account my background in the Basque Country in a situation completely more complicated, with two languages that are completely different, with a Basque speaker as a minority in the community. And with this background, I ask, how could be possible the Catalan political system not be able to show a bit of flexibility to drive this problem? Eva said that in the Catalan society, nobody asked for that. I am not so sure. No, there is a part of Catalan society that doesn't exist. It's silence. And maybe maybe in the Basque Country, I often say that the Basque Country is very diverse, territorially and in different matters. And I often I am with people who think that the whole Basque Country is like the small part in which they live. But this is not the reality. And maybe the part of society in which Eva lives don't know that other part of the society exists. And even if, and I will finish with that, even if that is very difficult for people to go to courts, to be signalized in the school as it happens, some people go to the courts. But to finish, my problem is what a minority it is, but there are some rights, some limits to this capacity to impose compulsory that Castilian could not be a language of instruction. I know that in the second education, the reality is different. But why? And why had the law, the act, to change the traditional system in which in the primary school, the system took into account the language of the pupils, and that the political system felt that that had to be changed.
Two remarks very, very quickly. The first, your approach is possible to deny the part of education is a language of the state is a political approach, and here we say no, there is another approach, a more pragmatic and relaxed approach. Now in Catalonia there are two new laws. I don't know if you are in your report that recognize the use of Castilian of curricular language. It's another way to say that is a language used in education. It's not true. The question is that before that, there is not a explicit mention about Castilian, but that not imply that Castilian is not present in the school, is not used in the school. That's absolute false. It's used in the school. In primary school, evidently, and the question is that there are two new laws that explicitly recognize or reinforce the autonomy of the schools to do their linguistic project and to manage the use of official language in the education. And that are two new laws where the Castilian is explicitly recognized. The question is before there is not an explicit mention as language of instruction, but its use. And the condition for the constitutionality of the mode is the not exclusion of Castilian, and that it's an assumption. It's an assumption that it's an exclusion of Castilian. And another question is to take education is a special sector with an objective, but at the same time is part of a more complex political language policy. And I think that in our case, the objective of guaranteeing the knowledge of both language is explicitly put in the task of education. The reality of other education models in Spain is that people doesn't know both language after school. In Valencia, there are a lot of pupils that finish and are not able to speak Valencian or Catalan. Our objective is guaranteeing the knowledge of both language. And I think it really is a very similar in the European context, because I think it's, for me, is the system that best performs this objective, to guarantee the knowledge of both language after school. No? And I think that this approach, more focused on pedagogical aspects, you see education like the language of the teacher, and now education is very more complex. The pedagogical task, the projects, the use of media, the use of internet. And I think that the use of language in education is more complex than to say that there is some subject in the use of Castilian is very present in the Catalan schools. I think is that, and I think it's very, very complex to say, but I think that there is a new approach to the question in the recent law in Catalonia that put the accent in pedagogical aspects, and that every school can organize the use of languages in different activities. That I say education is not only the language of the teacher when he's giving the lesson, but it's very more complex than that. And the use of Castilian is evident in all the education, evident more in secondary than primary.
I agree with what you said about there was a silent minority for many years, but that ended when some new parties brought the question of bilingualism back to the Catalan parliament. So I think that there was a silent minority who was not represented in their sometimes claims about the balance between Castellan and Spanish and Catalan. But I don't think it's more the case. The criticism was that the Catalan establishment was not clearly reflecting the plurality and diversity of society. And I fully agree with that until some new parties arrived and they were strongly outspoken about particularly this system. That being put aside, I would say that the solution by the jurisprudence about this 25% is not very satisfactory, but it's more symbolic. But I would say the solution by the Catalan government with the agreement of other parties on the opposition is neither, because it's not a solution first, but then we are mixing up practicity and legality. Of course, legally, from legal point of view, if you take an equality approach, it is true that this system leaves for the school to decide what's the social linguistic reality in their neighborhood, and then adapt and counterbalance. That's wonderful from a theoretical point of view. From a managerial practical point of view, means all the responsibility to the directors of the schools who are left with the decision of designing a highly sensible topic that might bring them to the court. On the other hand, it's not a question that could be controlled and managed. It's very difficult to manage that because it's very changing all the time. So I'm not sure that's the best solution. It's the practical solution we found, and we covered it up with in the law. But I don't think it's the best solution either. Sorry. So I think we will have to come up with something more sophisticated, but also more manageable in order to be practical at the different levels. So I understand the reaction by the government, by the Catalan government, but I think
Catalan parliament.
Or the government proposed that solution and the parliament, but it's true that the government then is not the government now. But I think it won't. I don't know if it will stand the constitutional challenge. I'm not sure. But I think that practically raises many questions in this sense. Yeah. Maybe this is a discussion probably for the coffee. For the coffee too. Sure, please.
I don't pretend to be answered, but two things. The questions that for which I ask hasn't not been answered. Sure. And my question to what Eva said is, if Castilian is used broadly in schools, why the government of Catalonia opposed these demands? I don't need answer.